Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. It again is my privilege to be able to spend this time with you. Hope you've had a good week so far, and hope that you have a good week ahead. If you're watching live, it is August the 9th, 2020. We're in the beginning the eighth part of our discussion regarding different hypotheses for how the universe and the world and life came to be, whether that is with a superior entity who designed and created it, or by some naturalistic or atheistic mechanisms. So we've looked at some of these questions and broken this overall big question, is there a God? Is there some kind of a superior entity or deity? Broken this really down into four areas that require explanation either by the action of a designing superior entity or by materialistic or naturalistic phenomena, that is, spontaneous things that did not involve any entity such as God, etc. So those are the questions that we've been looking at. We started with last week and really got into the third one of those after looking at the existence of the universe, the precision of the universe, then started looking at the initial appearance of any type of life on Earth. And so that's what we dig back into tonight. And then after that, we'll move to the fourth question involving evolution or no, etc. So what we looked at last week is what defines life at the most fundamental level. Even the most primitive life is extremely complex, and we went through a list of attributes that must exist to be able to say something is truly alive. And that was the shortest, most pared down list that I could come up with. So we talked about all of those functions that are carried on by all living organisms, be they a human being or a single cell bacteria, etc. We then looked at two of the primary atheistic or purely naturalistic hypotheses for this. One is panspermia, which we mentioned from Sir Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe, the idea that living organisms are floating all over the universe on meteorites, etc., and that the initial primitive life landed on Earth in this way. The reason that Hoyle put that forth, and Sir Frederick Hoyle was an atheist in every way, but he put that forth because what we're looking at tonight he found to be such a vexing problem, he just didn't think it could have happened in a spontaneous fashion. And that led him to say, well, okay, how did it happen? He didn't want that to be the action of a deity, a superior entity, and so he came up with this idea called panspermia. It is generally rejected by people on all sides, and again, not that we're taking a consensus vote, but the reason it's rejected is it doesn't have any explanatory power, because as you can see, that doesn't answer the question of where did it arise and how did it happen. It just kind of kicks it over a planet or two and assumes that life came into being somewhere else. Therefore, it really has no explanatory power and no evidence to support it either. And for those reasons, that one has been pretty much crossed off. Well, then we looked at what we're getting back into tonight, the idea of abiogenesis, and that is the hypothetical process by which non-living material on the early Earth might have become living material, a living organism. That is in quotation marks because I want us to keep in mind it is not a fact, as unfortunately is listed in many textbooks, etc. It is a hypothesis worthy of consideration, and that's what we're doing, and we'll pick back up again tonight. Of course, the other hypothesis is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Or if you don't want to look at the quotation from Genesis, just the idea that there was intelligent design and creation by a superior entity who is capable of creation. All right, so that's what we got into. And as I said a moment ago, abiogenesis usually just presented as an established fact, although there are serious problems with the hypothesis that we'll continue with tonight. We looked at a brief historical perspective for that and how these ideas came to be. We looked at the Miller-Urey experiment, a very clever, very innovative piece of scientific experimentation in 1952 and published in 1953 by Stanley Miller, a PhD graduate student, and his professor and mentor, the very well-known and Nobel Prize winner, Harold Urey. So we went through exactly what they did in their experiment and exactly what they found, including the fact that the amino acids that were produced in the experiment, and that was what they got, were of an equal mixture of right and left-handed forms, whereas only the left-handed forms appear in living organisms. So we looked at some of the other aspects of that experiment also, and if you didn't catch that, you may want to look back at part 7 for more elaboration on that. We then looked at the fact that what they got in that experiment was a handful of amino acids in both the left and right forms, but they got no peptides, no proteins, certainly not RNA and DNA, which is where things get really complicated. We looked at that just a little bit last week. And the fact that in RNA even, which is considered to be, well, it is the simpler molecule of the two, but still very, very complex in its own right. The idea, though, for a lot of people is, well, if you could get some RNA to form, then surely it could form itself into DNA. Well, that would be a big leap also, but as you'll see, we never really get to that point. RNA, though, even occurs in several different varieties. Messenger RNA, transcription RNA and ribosomal RNA. We'll come back to this, but the big blob in the middle of that chain of RNA is a ribosome, which is turning the information in the RNA into peptide sequences to make proteins. So we talked about the fact that RNA is an extremely complex molecule and some of the things that are required for it to work. The fact that DNA is upon which all life is based, plant, animal, right down to the very simplest, all of it is based on DNA. And it is far, far more complicated even than the very complex RNA. All right, so that's where we came to. It was not long after this, and about the same time that Miller and Urey were doing their experiment, James Watson and Francis Crick from the United Kingdom gave us the just earth-shaking discovery of the structure of DNA. And all of a sudden, as we've just looked at, things looked a whole lot more complicated than they were. Before this, many researchers had thought that the inside of a cell was not complicated at all. They could see cells under the microscope, but often assumed that what was in the cell was just some kind of homogeneous gel, and they called it protoplasm and figured, well, you know, that there was really not much to it. Now, they were aware of proteins, of course, and could even see that kind of the structure of some proteins and knew that those were fairly complex, but they thought, well, that was the most complex thing there was. Until DNA, and then until the electron microscope came along, and we got our first actual good look inside a cell and realized, oh my goodness, it's a whole nother universe all over again at the submicroscopic level. Every living cell, even the most simple of organisms, is an immensely complex, precisely ordered and functioning, not just a factory, it's doing 100 different things at any given time, with metabolism and replication and protein synthesis, etc. And so we now know quite a bit about the structures inside a cell, which are just as complex as the anatomy of a human or other mammal body itself. So it began to appear that there was a whole lot more to this than anybody thought. But where we pick up then is some competing ideas for proponents of abiogenesis. That's not one hypothesis, it's at least 4 different ones right now, and none of them agree. And it's interesting, kind of like, I guess, if you ever watched the pre-primary debate for a presidential election, etc., you'll notice that, of course, that maybe last time around, I think the Republican Party had 18 candidates, I think, and of course they're all tearing each other apart. The one thing that they're all unified on in either party is that the people in the other party, those candidates are horrible. That's the only thing they agree on. You'll see that they're actually, though, tearing each other's positions and policies and character apart in the primary debates. Well, that's kind of what happens here. There are any number of scientists who all believe in abiogenesis, that it happened, that living organisms came from non-living material on this planet. But there is no agreement between them on how that happened or what happened first. So you have a number of competing ideas for where this process supposedly started. But keep this in mind, no matter what you say happened first, it all had to happen before a cell could be deemed alive. All of these things had to happen and be in place all at the same time. But it's a tall order to think about producing a living organism from non-living elemental material. So this is no small feat, and the questions are daunting. But here are kind of the scenarios that you'll read about. One is that RNA occurred first, and as I said, the idea is if we can get some RNA, well, surely it won't be that difficult to turn it into DNA. But we got to at least get some RNA. We know that. So the idea came about from Orgel in 1968 that maybe this was the way abiogenesis occurred, that somehow RNA formed first, and we're going to look at that more in just a moment. So another scientist, Gilbert, termed this, well, this is the RNA world. And that's not an amusement park, or, et cetera. But the idea was, well, we're going to create this hypothetical world and scenario and mechanism by which RNA occurred first, okay? Well, another competing idea is that metabolism occurred first before RNA, there were molecules that began to be able to extract energy, whether it be heat, et cetera, from the environment around them and put it to use, turn it into chemical energy so that it could fuel chemical reactions to let there be life. And so they said that probably either at some deep sea hydrothermal vents where very hot water is jetting out of rocks from a volcanic type origin, or in volcanic hydrothermal vents, that maybe the heat from these is what stirred some of those molecules to be able to do this and to become more and more complex. And then, of course, they would have developed RNA later, but the metabolism came first. So some people call that, well, that whole school of thought is the metabolism world. Well, a third one is that the first thing was neither of those. It was containment, because a cell has to have a membrane for reasons we talked about before, to separate it from the surrounding environment, to allow there to be molecules and chemicals in that cell that can have reactions that can't happen in the presence of water, et cetera, or free water. So the idea was there, well, maybe this lipid or fat-based membrane somehow formed first, and then this collection of molecules formed RNA, began to carry on metabolism, et cetera, and then it all came together. Other people are saying, no, none of those things can work by themselves. It all had to happen at once, and of course it did, in ways that we don't know, but it all happened at once. So I just want you to know that there are multiple hypotheses under this umbrella of abiogenesis. And most of these people will all be very happy to tell you how stupid all the others are and how stupid their theories are, because it obviously could not have happened that way. And they do all provide quite a bit of evidence to disprove each other. But that's a debate for another day. Just wanted you to have an overview of what it is. Well, let's take a look, at least briefly, at some of those. The first one we're going to look at is this RNA first speculation, or the school of thought that forms the RNA world. So what I'm going to read to you, just a quick quote here, and we're going to, of course, have to summarize this in just the most brief fashion to get through any of this, and because I don't want to bore you with a lot of the stuff that's not quite as fascinating to you as it might be to me and to some others. But I'll tell you where I got this, and it's a very interesting resource. One of the best summaries I could find of all of the various schools of thought of abiogenesis was evidently a documentary that was on BBC, and I don't know if that was on television, radio, etc. I found the text of it, which is freely available on the internet. It's quite lengthy. It's probably 50 some odd pages or so. If you're interested in this, it's really good reading. Now, it's biased as anything, and it's kind of jaw-dropping in some cases at the lack of insight that the author gives. But he's very thorough, and he does present all these different ideas. Now, nowhere will you find any possibility that it could have been anything but abiogenesis by a completely atheistic mechanism, but it's a good summary and well written. Very readable by the intelligent reader who doesn't necessarily have a biological background. It's by Michael Marshall, and the reference is on the bottom of the slide there from BBC.com. And by the way, I get semi-tickled at the headlines on these articles that you read, because everyone, hey, we have got it now. We have figured out the secret. In fact, the title of Marshall's documentary is "The Secret of How Life on Earth Began." And I thought, wow, okay, I guess I missed something while I was asleep. They've got the thing figured out. No, anything but. So I don't know why they come up with headlines like this. It's kind of like we used to see this stuff all the time. I remember a headline on a newspaper, it must have been this big, and it said, "Life on Mars," with a huge exclamation point. And so, well, you think it means exactly what it says. Ha, silly us for thinking that. But no, when you read the article, what it really was is they found some little cracks in the photographs, some little cracks on the surface of Mars, and they thought, well, those cracks could mean that there might have been water there at some time in the ancient past. And if there was water there, well, that's a necessary thing for any kind of life. So therefore, the headline was Life on Mars. Yeah. Okay, you kind of get the picture here, but never mind the titles. The work is always interesting. So here's something he says about this idea of RNA forming first. Writing in Nature, the journal, in 1986, Gilbert proposed that life began in the RNA world. The first stage of evolution, Gilbert argued, consisted of RNA molecules performing the catalytic activities. You know, a catalyst is something that speeds up a chemical reaction or even just allows it to happen at all. It's kind of a tool that can put things together chemically and make it happen where it wouldn't have happened otherwise. Okay, so it consisted of RNA molecules performing the catalytic activities necessary to assemble themselves from a nucleotide soup. By cutting and pasting different bits of RNA together, the RNA molecules could create ever more useful sequences. Eventually, they found a way to make proteins and protein enzymes, which proved so useful that they largely supplanted the RNA versions and gave rise to life as we recognize it today. All right? I don't know if you caught glaring omissions there, huge unexplained assumptions, and things that just plain didn't make sense. Let's take another look at that. I mean, because what I want you to see here is, and I don't mean disrespect to anybody, but I do mean to challenge the idea. That's what we have to do. I want you to see if we get put a little scrutiny on this, it just falls apart completely. And like I say at the top of the slide here, do you need some RNA to just create itself? Hey, no problem. Just ignore those pesky details and let's just say it happened, okay? Okay, let's look at this again then. Gilbert says the first stage of evolution, or in this case abiogenesis, consisted of RNA molecules performing the catalytic activities necessary to assemble themselves. Okay, RNA molecules which don't exist yet, performing these very complex chemical reactions to create themselves. Oh, okay. I didn't realize it was so easy. You just get it to create itself and perform all of the very complex catalytic reactions. No problem. You just get it to do that itself, to assemble itself. Are you getting the problem there? Next part, from a nucleotide soup. That is, that all of the necessary bases, nucleotide bases for DNA and RNA, well, evidently they were all, man, it was just thick with these things, except that they don't occur in nature outside of living organisms, and nobody's been able to make them. But somehow he's got a thick soup just full of them, and they just catalyze their own reactions, and RNA just makes itself. Whatever's necessary, that's what it did, okay? By cutting and pasting different bits of RNA together, do you know it's an incredible string of enzymes and molecules that it takes to cut and paste different bits of RNA together. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens in a very precisely ordered fashion. Amazing stuff. And it happens within the factories of living cells. And it doesn't happen anywhere else. But it does here, though. By cutting and pasting different bits of RNA together, the RNA molecules, which don't exist, could create ever more useful sequences. Well, how convenient. Again, I never knew it was so simple, because everything we know says it's incredibly complex and can't be reproduced even by the smartest humans with the best tools in the best labs. But hey, don't worry about that. It just happened. Eventually, they found a way to make proteins and protein enzymes. Oh, okay. Well, how did we get from here to here? Oh, don't worry about that. Eventually, they found a way. No problem. They just did because we said so. I mean, if you've got your brain encaged, you got to be banging your head against the wall by this point with everything that's assumed, left out, glossed over, etc. He says, and when they did that, hey, that was so useful, that just changed everything and gave rise to life as we recognize it today. Please, you almost want to say, don't insult my intelligence by even saying things like that. Can I show you a scenario that's far more likely than the one we just read about? And of course, that was just a brief summary. How about this? How about one Saturday I'm working there at home and I realize I got to make a quick run to Home Depot, and I leave the lawnmower sitting in the driveway. So I head off to Home Depot, and when I get back 45 minutes later, hey, my lawnmower has just cut and pasted and assembled itself into a Lamborghini. Why not? That's convenient. Of course, I couldn't even afford the insurance on such a thing anyway. It's fun to look at. But you know what? You may say, well, that couldn't happen in 45 minutes. Okay, fine. How about 100 million years? Fill in anything you like. You and I both know that is not possible. How does the lawnmower assemble itself into ever more useful sequences until finally it's got computer-controlled injection, timing, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, but look, what I'm showing you on the screen, I hope it makes the point, because that's a whole lot more likely than what we just read. And let's not forget another detail with RNA called a ribosome, and another reason why things don't self-assemble. All right? The ribosome is that big, huge blob you see in the middle there. Ribosomes are complex molecules. That would be the understatement of the century right there. They are very precise factories built of some proteins acting as enzymes, wrapped around some metal portions, and also including some RNA themselves. And it takes all of that in exactly the right arrangement to make a ribosome. What does a ribosome do? It is the reader, or the translator, you might say, of the code of information that's stored in the RNA, which in turn came from DNA. And what the ribosome does when the cell activates these incredibly complex molecules and enzymes to say, essentially, all right, we need some more of this protein produced. So the DNA opens up to the right section that controls the synthesis of that protein. It creates a piece of, the enzymes create a piece of what's called messenger RNA. That leaves the nucleus of the cell to come out into the protoplasm, which, as we saw, is nothing simple whatsoever. And then messenger RNA starts, the messenger RNA that came from the nucleus is there ready to be read and transcribed, you might say, into the sequence to make a protein. Well, bits of transcription RNA then start bringing exactly the right nucleotide bases so that it can put them together. The ribosome is that catalytic molecule. You remember it talked about they self-catalyzed? Yeah, fat chance. The ribosome is the catalytic molecule that takes those nucleotide bases and puts them in exactly the order that was specified from the DNA and then the messenger RNA. And links them together, which cannot happen by itself, to make the sequence of a protein. And then the cell does some other things to it too to activate the protein. But that's what a ribosome does. None of that happens without a ribosome. This is why things don't self-assemble, because the assembly apparatus is incredibly complicated, as is the process by which it works. Well, here's the thing then. Ribosomes are absolutely necessary for RNA to do anything. RNA is useless without a ribosome to read it and turn the information into the functional proteins. Now, the ribosome itself, as we said, is composed of some proteins, some RNA, some metal, etc. You want to know where the instructions for how to build a ribosome, where those are stored? Take a guess. The instructions are stored on the DNA. So to make a ribosome, you have to have a ribosome to be able to read the DNA and the RNA to create another ribosome. And without a ribosome, you get nothing. You've got nothing but useless complex molecules sitting there. So the ribosome is no good without the RNA. The RNA and the DNA is no good without the ribosome. They're both incredibly complex, and they both have to exist right from the word go, or you've got nothing. Okay, if you think chicken and egg, oh yeah, this is the ultimate chicken and egg question because you got to have both together. Every cell of every organism on this planet has DNA and ribosomes, et cetera, et cetera. All right? Now, Karl Popper, and do you remember, we've talked about him several sessions back, the philosopher and scientist who gave us the principle that anything that cannot be potentially falsified, you ought to be extremely wary of, okay, which is good advice. Not that it could not be true, but you may be asked to accept something as almost magic if it's something that there's no way to test it or potentially disprove it. Okay, that's one and the same Karl Popper. Definitely not a believer in a superior entity, I can tell you. But here's what he said. He says, what makes the origin of life and of the genetic code a disturbing riddle is this. The genetic code is without any biological function unless it is translated. That is, unless it leads to the synthesis of the proteins whose structure is laid down by the code. But, as Monod points out, the machinery by which the cell, at least the non-primitive cell, which is the only one we know, translates the code, consists of at least 50 macromolecular components which are themselves coded in the DNA. Thus, the code cannot be translated except by using certain products of its translation. This constitutes a really baffling circle, a vicious circle, it seems, for any attempt to form a model or theory of the genesis of the genetic code. Thus, we may be faced with the possibility that the origin of life, like the origin of the universe, becomes an impenetrable barrier to science and a residue to all attempts to reduce biology to chemistry and physics. Okay, Popper got it right. There's a huge problem there by just saying, well, these RNAs self-assembled. No, it doesn't happen. And how did you get a ribosome without, well, I think you see. I hope that the gravity of that problem becomes real to you and apparent. But if the gravity of that ribosome problem doesn't quite jump out at you, permit me to give you another one of my nerd illustrations. Let's suppose, and for this illustration, you're going to be a young lady. You're there at home one day, there's a knock on the door, and you look out, and the person who's standing on your porch could be your identical twin. I mean, you could be looking in a mirror. You open the door, and the young lady looks at you, and she says, oh my goodness, the photographs were right. We really could be identical twins. And that's what you were thinking. And she goes, I'm sorry, my name is Susan. And you say, are we related? And she goes, oh, yes. She says, in fact, I'm your great-great-great-great-granddaughter. I'll be born about 150 years from now. And you think, uh-huh. And she goes, well, we've kind of figured out very limited, but a little bit of time travel. And I had the opportunity to choose one person to go back and visit. And she said, that didn't take half a second. It was you. I know all about you. I've read all about you. She says, in fact, you're kind of a household name for reasons that haven't happened yet, so I can't tell you that. She said, but I just had to come and meet you and visit you. So you invite her in, and she says, but my visit will only last maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then the charge will wear off, and I will fade back into my own time. She said, so we don't have long. But anyway, you have, needless to say, a fascinating visit. And she said, well, look, before I disappear here, I want to give you something. She said, I've got a lot of information that I thought you would find interesting. And she said, there's a lot on there. But one thing is, the cold and flu thing? She said, well, we still have that, but there's a simple little recipe with things you've got in your kitchen right now that if you just mix that and drink it, the symptoms will be gone in about an hour and a half, and you'll be fine until the next time you catch one. So that sounds pretty good. She said, and there's just a whole lot of stuff. She said, so I just recorded all of it here on this little plasma holographic matrix data tube, and so I'll leave that with you. And you say, oh, okay, great. Well, how will I see the information that's stored on there? And she goes, oh, that's easy. Just drop it in any plasma holographic matrix data player, and it'll just come right up, and you just select what you want. And you say, well, we don't have that yet. And she goes, oh, no problem. They're actually very easy to build one. And she says, and I put the instructions for it right there on the data tube, so you can just make one real easy. And she goes, oh, I think I'm starting to fade. She goes, it's been so good to zzz, and she's gone. So you're standing there holding your plasma holographic matrix data tube, and how are you going to read that? Because the instructions for the reader are stored right there in what you can't read. That's RNA and DNA without ribosomes, and in fact a whole cadre of other enzymes and proteins that have to go with it. It's an insurmountable problem. Well, let's kind of recap then this abiogenesis idea via the RNA first model. So we got a few problems here. Number one, there was never any evidence basis existing for conjecturing this hypothesis in the first place. Now, if you want to be a purist, if you're going to start testing a hypothesis, there ought to be something to suggest it, some kind of observation, evidence, etc. But that's okay. I'm willing to overlook that. I love good original thinking no matter what. So I'm kind of okay with overlooking that one and just saying, well, never mind whether there was a reason to have this idea. Somebody had the idea, so let's look at it. So I'm gonna be okay with that one. Number two, no part of this has ever been observed. It just doesn't happen in nature. Our observations, in fact, unanimously show that what's being conjectured and hypothesized here does not happen. And you say, well, it happened within exactly the right location, except there's no way to believe that. There's no way to know that. Nothing of the sort has ever been observed anywhere. Number three, no part of this has ever been produced experimentally. And I say despite extensive and very innovative efforts. You've got some brilliant people trying to make this happen, trying to prove this hypothesis or figure out exactly how. And they've spent their whole careers doing this, and they can't make it happen. No matter what they do, they can't make any of it happen experimentally. And believe me, it's not for lack of effort. Number four, it's completely incompatible with what we can observe. There is one atheistic scientist has said it takes a battalion, and that's true, a huge number of very complex enzymes that are needed to form or to replicate RNA and DNA. And we've kind of alluded to that, okay? It's just incompatible with what we know about these things. And we've had quite a number of decades now to learn about them. Finally, these reactions are destroyed. If you could get these things to happen, they would be ripped apart immediately by contact with free water or oxygen. So you're saying, oh, this happened in this primordial soup. Well, even if you could get it to happen, it would be destroyed immediately. And this is not secret information either. Well, okay, so let's just look then at a brief overview of the metabolism first school of thought. Since there are problems with this RNA first. Again, I'll pick a piece from Mr. Marshall's documentary here. Some of the proponents of this, it says, once life had harnessed the chemical energy of the vent water, remember we're talking about maybe hot water vents under the sea or around a volcano or something. Once life had harnessed the chemical energy of the vent water, Russell and Martin say, it started making molecules like RNA. Eventually, it created its own membrane and became a true cell and escaped the porous rock into the open water. Again, I had no idea it was just so easy, because everybody thinks it's really, really complicated and difficult, but evidently not. You just say, once life had harnessed the chemical energy of the vent water, what life? That's the whole question. It started making molecules like RNA. How in the world did it start making molecules? Especially like RNA, which humans can't make. Eventually, it created its own membrane. Like magic. It became a true cell. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just so convenient that whatever we need to happen, well, it just happened. How? Oh, well, don't get caught up in details. It just happened. Well, and listen, I'm not being unfair with this either. I may sound a tiny bit sarcastic, but I'm not being unfair. I'm dealing with this quite honestly, quite fairly, as to the problems with here. So how about this metabolism first method? Well, just like before, got a few problems here. Let me look at 2 and 3 again. Same things. No part of this has ever been observed. It exists only in the mind of the people who are telling you that it happened. It doesn't happen in nature. No part of this, none of it, has ever been produced experimentally. Again, despite brilliant work over decades by really smart and very well-funded researchers. And in this case, they don't even have a conjectured sequence for it. It's as vague as what I just read to you. Not even a fanciful, wishful thinking sequence. They don't even have that. Completely incompatible with what we can observe. These things do not take place in water. It's why some of the competing teams really sneer at this idea and call it stupid. So you can't get that. It doesn't happen. Everybody knows that. The excuses that they give for why it could still happen in water, you can read it if you're interested, but not viable in any way. So there's just a lot of problems. If we looked at, and I'm not going to go into them, I told you there were at least 4 kind of major schools of thought. The one of containment first, that it formed a membrane and then started doing all this stuff, or that it all happened at once. These schools of thought are just as full of holes as the 2 that we looked at, and they actually have even less structured conjecture, if you can believe it, than those. They're even more vague and magical thinking than the 2 that we took a quick look at there. So got a little problem with any of these hypotheses. Next, there's no evidence to support any of these ideas, be it observational, experimental, with lengthy and concerted and very intelligent effort. I applaud the people who are doing the work. They're really smart people. They're doing very careful work. It's just not going anywhere, okay? But very intelligent effort. This stuff doesn't happen, and you can't get it to happen. And it doesn't really matter what order you suggest that it happened in. The fact is, you got to get it all to happen. You have to explain all of it coinciding. And no one can even come close to explaining even the tiniest individual piece of it. That's a problem. Next is the need for a ribosome, like we talked about, and quite a number of additional, very complex structures that can catalyze the reactions we're talking about that supposedly assembled themselves, etc. These reactions will not occur otherwise without a ribosome, etc. and this remains as much a problem as ever. That problem's not going away until you can answer it, which nobody can. So it doesn't matter what you claim happened first, since the evidence overwhelmingly indicates that none of it ever happened at all. That's the only thing you can surmise from this if you're honest and using your brain. In fact, the only details still missing are every single one of them. I just can't be emphatic enough. It's not that, well, we've got it all figured out except for one or two little things. It's we've got nothing. We have got nothing. Every single detail exists only in the imagination. Remember Stanley Miller, the young graduate student who did the Miller-Urey experiment? A few years ago, shortly before he passed away, unfortunately, he was interviewed about some of these things. He had nothing good to say about any of them. He said they're all wrong. And in fact, he implied that it was some pretty shoddy science going on with all of this, that it was pointless. And he said, but someday we'll find that self-replicating molecule and we'll have the answer. So he realizes nobody's even close, but still, we're going to find it. It happened. It's out there. We're going to find it. So here's the thing, I guess. Don't let the total lack of explanation and one fatal flaw after another in these hypotheses, don't let that stand in the way of just assuming it all just happened anyway, like Professor Hawking does. I'm not going to read you the passage in here because I think you're probably starting to get the point. But this is, again, from Brief Answers to the Big Questions that we've looked at some before, pages 73 to 75. Dr. Hawking, Professor Hawking, he says, DNA is extremely hard to produce. In fact, humans can't even figure out how to produce it. Living cells can. He says, and it does not self-assemble, but it did. And that's a brief summary. But he goes into quite a number of paragraphs which say exactly that. It doesn't happen. It's extremely unlikely, like it doesn't happen. We don't know how it happened, but clearly it happened because we're here. So where does it go from here with the idea of abiogenesis? Well, people are working on planet simulators, but that's kind of what Miller and Urey did. They're better now with getting some of the right mixtures. I told you there were some problems with that experiment. It was actually a little bit too conducive to life. Now that we know a little bit more. But they're working on planet simulators, and it's kind of the same idea as that, and origin of life simulators. So it's kind of more sophisticated experiments of the Miller-Urey type. There are whole books being written about the search for a unified theory of life. It just can't be the one that we don't want. I'm aware of a unified theory of life, but we can't have that one. Can't even give any possible consideration to the idea that there could be design and creation going on by a superior entity. No, we want a unified theory of life. We just don't want that one. And I was reading some papers week before last, are now seriously suggesting, since we'll never know how it happened, that we just deem it adequately explained and move on. What? We've explained nothing except to illuminate that all of these things are dead ends. Let me tell you just a couple of things in our closing minutes. I want to read to you some quotes from people, and these are not people who believe in a superior entity, just honest observers. Research on the origin of life seems to be unique in that the conclusion has already been authoritatively accepted. Kind of like we've seen, let's just assume it happened. What remains to be done is to find the scenarios which describe the detailed mechanisms and processes by which this happened. One must conclude that, contrary to the established and current wisdom, a scenario describing the genesis of life on earth by chance and natural causes, which can be accepted on the basis of fact and not faith, has not yet been written. That couldn't be more true. The things that are coming out are simply not believable on any scientific or intellectual basis, and yet they are accepted anyway. Like he says, they're not accepted because of evidence and fact. They're accepted because people desperately choose to believe them. How about this one? From Francis Crick. You remember who discovered the DNA structure? Francis Crick and James Watson, Nobel Prize winner, obviously. In 1981 said, "An honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle." Pretty strong statement from a man who is a definite, enthusiastic atheist. And yet he realizes the magnitude of the problem of trying to say that this happened without the action of some superior entity. Almost a miracle? I think that's an understatement. It just doesn't happen, and you can't get it to happen. So what do? After nearly 70 years, the Miller-Urey experiment in 1952, here we are 68 years later. After all that time and all that work from all of those people, when every single version of your hypothesis of abiogenesis turns out to be another dead end, and that's exactly what they are, well, don't let that stop you again. Just play the multiple universe and anthropic principle card one more time, because that's the trump card for everything. Just say, well, there are some infinite number, which in fact is an inaccuracy in itself. There's some infinite or huge number of parallel universes. So, even though this is just ridiculously impossible, pretty much, okay, to happen, well, you get that many universes, it's going to happen in one of them. An anthropic principle, and it must have happened by chance because here we are. You just throw that one more time for anything that cannot possibly be true, cannot possibly be explained. This is from Dr. Eugene Koenen in 2007. Notice the accuracy of his observation, but then what he does to explain it away. Despite considerable experimental and theoretical effort, no compelling scenarios currently exist for the origin of replication and translation, the key processes that together comprise the core of biological systems and the apparent prerequisite of biological evolution. The RNA world concept might offer the best chance for the resolution of this conundrum, but so far cannot adequately account for the emergence of an efficient RNA replicase or the translation system. That is, it's missing the ribosome, etc. The many worlds in one version of the cosmological model of eternal inflation could suggest a way out of this conundrum. Okay, he says, we're stuck, man. We're at an absolute dead end any way you turn. You can't explain this. You can't get it to happen. So how do we get out of that? Well, let's play the old multiple universes card. He says it might suggest a way out of this conundrum because in an infinite multiverse with a finite number of distinct macroscopic histories, each repeated an infinite number of times, okay, get millions of universes and then keep replaying them millions and millions of times again, each. The emergence of even highly complex systems by chance is not just possible, but inevitable. It's like, yeah, this is impossible. Hey, but no problem. You just have enough multiple universes, and then it becomes not just possible, it's inevitable. Well, we've talked before about the logical fallacies in the multiverse problem, and at the moment, I won't go through those again. We probably will review those again at some point, because it just keeps popping up, and it's still just as nonsensical as it ever was. But think about this. By the logic that Dr. Koenen just used here, you can just dream up anything, absolutely anything, no matter what, and just claim that, it's not just possible, it's inevitable, because multiple universes. So whenever you have some thought construct that just gives you free license to throw out any kind of whimsical fairy tale you want and then claim that, it's not only possible, it's inevitable. There's something wrong with that thought process. That you can be guaranteed. And when you have to resort to dreaming up millions of parallel universes to try to make something sound even remotely plausible, believe me, you have hit a dead end and simply won't admit it. So, at what point do you finally acknowledge the falsity of a hypothesis and start honestly considering the alternatives? I mean, where does it end? You might say, because I tried to think, is there any way that you could justify intellectually to keep hammering at this and saying, oh, we know it happened, we know it happened, we know it happened, you know, in spite of the evidence that we have in front of us now in 2020? And the only thing that even came to my mind was, you might say, well, you know, it's well known Thomas Edison had failure after failure when he was trying to invent the light bulb, but he just kept going, and finally he found that, you know, a tungsten filament was the, you know, et cetera. But he kept going, failure after failure. But you know what the difference is? He had already proven that his invention worked. He was just trying to improve it and make it not burn out quite as quick. He was looking for a better material for a filament because he had already proven that his light bulb worked. So it's not analogous at all, but that's the only thing I could even think of. Here's one, though. If you're going to spend your whole career still saying, yes, abiogenesis happened, it happened, we don't know how, it doesn't make any sense, but it happened. I mean, you might just as well spend your entire career trying to figure out exactly how it was that I shot President John F. Kennedy and got away with it. It's far more likely than any of the things we're talking about. Now, never mind that I was, I think, 5 months old at the time that President Kennedy was shot. Don't let that stop you. We'll find a way. Hey, multiple universes are, you know. And never mind that our family lived in Wellington, New Zealand at the time, and that's where I was. It's hard to get much further away from Dallas than that. But hey, maybe I did it somehow. You know, but at what point do you just say, okay, no, this hypothesis doesn't make any sense. It's been disproven over and over again. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that. And so, why will we not acknowledge that? I think the answer is made very clear in a quote, and believe me, I am not misquoting these people, and I am not taking them out of context, from Professor Harold Urey. Miller-Urey experiment, Nobel Prize winner, etc. And I've gone back and read everything I could. Dr. Urey did not believe that a superior entity had anything to do with this universe. He evidently believed, and by the way, he said everybody should follow the 10 Commandments, although he thought they were just concocted by men, but he thought they were really good and that we all needed to follow them, especially scientists. Interesting. He thought that there might be some kind of an entity out there, but that he did nothing except just open his hand and let things happen by themselves. So he did not challenge abiogenesis. Look what he says. This is in an interview in January 1962. All of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We all believe, as an article of faith, that life evolved from dead matter on this planet. It's just that its complexity is so great, it is hard for us to imagine that it did. That's probably a pretty good capsule. The whole idea is simply unbelievable, but he says, but as an article of faith, we know it happened. How about logic and intellect instead? And this is not the faith that I talked about, believing something you haven't seen yet because you have an evidence-based, rock-solid belief in the source. No, he just says, this is an a priori conclusion. It just happened because we said it happened. We know there cannot possibly be a creator who made it happen. We're committed to that as an article of faith. It's just that it doesn't really make any sense. But hey, let's just keep believing it anyway, shall we? Well, so for our third major question, the initial appearance and survival of life on this planet, panspermia, universally rejected. Abiogenesis, not testable, so it's not actually science, not observable in any way. There is no hypothesis, sub-hypothesis of these that we've looked at that's accepted. and none of them are compatible with known science and all of the evidence that's all around us after all this time. The hypothesis still has no explanatory power. And yet there is a hypothesis that fits perfectly with what we see, if one wished to consider it. Creation, intelligent design by a superior entity. Next week, let's take up our fourth question and get into evolution. Assuming you could get some life, how could you turn it into a human being? I hope that you'll join us for that. I think that's going to be an interesting discussion, and I hope you have a great week in the meantime. Thank you again for joining us.